Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee for president in the 2020 election, and his vice presidential selection committee is, at the time of this recording, hard at work vetting potential running mates. While Biden has in the past stated that more than a dozen women were being considered, more recent reporting reveals that the list has significantly narrowed. As his search entered a second round of vetting, insiders acknowledge that Biden's committee has narrowed the field to as few as 6 serious contenders. But just who exactly made that list is still a closely guarded secret. In this video, I'm going to break down my list of the top 10 most likely contenders for Biden's VP pick. I'll talk about their relative strengths and weaknesses when it comes to adding to Biden's presidential ticket, but I'm really not making this video about who I think Biden should pick as a running mate. I already discussed that in a previous video. In this one, I'm answering this question: who will he pick? Question Time Politics is brought to you in part by the patrons. A big shout out to the newest supporters of this channel: Jocelyn Butcher, Brent, Brandon O, Grimless Stand, Mo Al-Kadi, Matthias Holton, and Keval Prajapati. Of course, I extend a tremendous thank you to everyone who supports this channel over at patreon.com/questiontime. In fact, let's give an extra special and a Versa thanks to patrons who have been supporting this channel for over a year now: Victor Holmberg, Denkuro, Question Time Fanac 2020, and CMAC. Those are some OG patrons, so thanks guys. Kicking off our list of the top 10 most likely Joe Biden running mates is Karen Bass, U.S. Representative for California's 37th Congressional District and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus for the 116th Congress. Prior to serving in the U.S. House, she was Speaker of the California State Assembly, the first black woman to do so. We learned in late June that Karen Bass was one of the women being vetted by the Biden campaign. Obviously, there are some superficially apparent advantages to Bass. Democrats have a general interest in adding diversity to the presidential ticket so that the ticket is a match for the Democratic voting base, meaning a woman of color is very likely to be preferred. Biden's team will pay special attention to black women in particular, in part because Biden owes much of his political power to the black community, from Barack Obama to Jim Clyburn to the black Democratic primary voters of South Carolina. Obviously, the George Floyd protests add even more pressure for the Democrats to represent the black community on the ticket. But renewed interest in issues surrounding Black Lives Matter and policing do not just advance Karen Bass for skin-deep reasons. As the Wall Street Journal reported, Representative Karen Bass has been working to stop police abuse and harassment since 1973, the year George Floyd was born. Inviting Bass to join Biden's ticket would send a clear signal to the black community that he cares about them and their issues. Still, there are some negative indicators for Karen Bass's chances. The ultimate choice of who Biden picks will probably come down to who he gets along with best. And the two do not appear to enjoy the same kind of relationship as Biden does with other names on this list. While Bass is a fairly experienced politician, she does not have experience as a governor of a state, or as a US senator, or in a top-level White House job. This may make her viewed as less prepared to step into the role as president, should the need arise. There has also been some minor pushback on the idea of Karen Bass because of what I take to be a fairly benign press release after the passing of Fidel Castro. That press release read, "As Cuba begins 9 days of mourning, I wish to express my condolences to the Cuban people and the family of Fidel Castro. The passing of the Comandante en Jefe is a great loss to the people of Cuba. I hope together our two nations will continue on the new path of support and collaboration with one another and continue in the new direction of diplomacy." Now, apparently for many Cuban Americans, referring to Castro as Comandante en Jefe or Commander-in-Chief was a bridge too far. Others were apparently dismayed that she referred to Castro's passing as a great loss to the people of Cuba. I personally think that Bass likely didn't even write this press release herself, but Democrats are extremely cautious of upsetting the Cuban community in Florida. Without them, Florida would be a fairly solid Republican state. Biden would clearly want to avoid any potential disadvantage in an already growingly Republican swing state. Up next at number 9 is Tammy Baldwin. Baldwin has served as the junior U.S. Senator from Wisconsin since January of 2013, and before that in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Wisconsin State Assembly. Baldwin was the first openly gay woman to serve in Congress and the first openly gay person to be elected to the Senate. While Baldwin has not clearly commented on whether she's being considered as a running mate, a number of mainstream outlets have put her forward, and she has claimed she's in regular contact with Biden. It's highly likely that she's being vetted. Baldwin's deep ties in Wisconsin are no doubt seen as a strong potential advantage for Biden's team. Wisconsin is likely to be one of the most hotly contested battleground states for the 2020 presidential election. While there is a big push for Biden to pick a woman of color, there's no doubt that a lesbian running mate would be likewise historical and would satiate the mainstream demand for identity politics credentials to balance out the ticket. At the same time, picking Baldwin would not likely be well received by members of the black community who are hoping to get a black Veep in the White House. There is another very serious problem with Baldwin. If Joe Biden selects her, this would create a Senate vacancy that would be filled by a special election. In a swing state like Wisconsin, there's no guarantee that that seat would be filled by a Democrat. Losing even one seat could make the difference in the Democratic Party's efforts to take back control of the Senate. For very similar reasons to this, I suspected that Jeanne Shaheen would not end up being Biden's running mate, despite the fact that he had previously touted her as a possible pick. Indeed, she has since declined to be vetted for the job. I would not be surprised if Biden's team or Baldwin herself might also think that she best serves the party by holding on to her seat in the Senate. Jumping into number 8 on our list, we have, by sheer coincidence, another Tammy. Tammy Duckworth, U.S. Senator from Illinois since 2017 and former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 8th District from 2013 until 2017. Prior to that, Duckworth served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of Veteran Affairs. Tammy Duckworth is certainly not the most well-known figure on this list, but she does have something that most of the field lacks: a gripping personal story. While Duckworth was born in Bangkok, Thailand to a mother of Chinese descent, her father was a U.S. Army veteran who served in World War II and traces his American ancestry all the way back to the Revolution. Duckworth moved around a lot as a youth throughout Southeast Asia and eventually Hawaii. As a result, she's multilingual, fluent in Thai and Indonesian. Following in the footsteps of her father and paternal ancestors, Duckworth joined the U.S. military, becoming a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Reserve in 1992, before transferring to the Army National Guard and later the Illinois Army National Guard. While working toward a PhD in political science, Duckworth was deployed to Iraq in 2004. In November of that year, her Black Hawk helicopter was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade. As a result, she lost her right leg and her left below the knee. She also lost nearly half her blood in the attack, which doctors at the time told local news reporters would have been fatal were it not for recent advances in battlefield medicine. During her physical therapy, she would experience yet another loss, that of her father. In 2006, Duckworth ran for Congress, winning the Democratic primary but losing in the general by less than 5,000 votes to Republican Peter Roskam. Weeks later, she was appointed director of the Illinois Department of Veteran Affairs by the infamous Rod Blagojevich. This would lead to a role as Assistant Secretary of Veteran Affairs in the Obama administration, and eventually another shot at running for Congress in 2012. This one successful. Then, after eventually working her way up to the Senate at age 50, she became the first senator to ever give birth while in office. A relatively inspirational figure and person of color to boot, like everyone, Duckworth also has her drawbacks. For one thing, when she led the Illinois Department of Veteran Affairs, she had to settle a lawsuit accusing her of workplace retaliation for $26,000. In 2018, she was notably dismissive of another Democratic woman with an inspirational personal story, the waitress-turned-congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When asked about whether AOC represents the future of the Democratic Party, Duckworth responded, "I think it's the future of the party in the Bronx. I think that you can't win the White House without the Midwest, and I don't think you can go too far to the left and still win the Midwest." Duckworth's dismissal of the left certainly doesn't make her the best choice to unify the Democratic Party. At the same time, it's unlikely Biden's team would turn their noses up at a disabled minority woman war hero from the Midwest with experience in both the legislative and executive branches of the federal government. It's also worth noting that Biden is likely to make the final decision based on personal connection, and he certainly has a history of connecting with people over personal tragedy and loss. Certainly Duckworth has seen her fair share of that. Ranking at number 7 on my list is Maggie Hassan, junior U.S. Senator from New Hampshire since 2017, who also served as governor of the state from 2013 to 2017. Prior to that, she was the majority leader of the New Hampshire Senate. Hassan has not recently been as hyped up by the mainstream media as some of the other names on this list, but Biden actually specifically mentioned her, although not by name, as a potential VP pick, and that has got to increase her odds somewhat. It's also been reported that she's been vetted for the job by the Biden campaign. Now, Joe Biden has stated that he wants a running mate who's ready to be president on day one. Some of the best experience you can have for that job is U.S. Senator or governor of a state. The fact that Hassan has both on her resume is a substantial advantage. The fact that she is from a likely battleground state is icing on the cake. In general, Hassan is a substantial candidate with few downsides, but there are downsides. For one thing, she's not 100% scandal-free. In 2014, she was ordered to return $24,000 in campaign contributions that were received in violation of New Hampshire campaign finance law. 2 months later, her campaign had to return another $25,000 to a union that had not properly registered as a political committee. In 2019, former Hassan staffers pled guilty to federal crimes, specifically illegally accessing personal information about 5 Republican senators through Senate computers and distributing the information online. Another potential problem with Hassan is her likely inability to excite Democratic voters. Eager to get Latino and Black voters to the polls, Biden's team is likely to prefer a person of color. In attempts to unite the party and get young people out to vote, Biden might want a running mate he can tout as a progressive. That's a tough sell with Hassan as well. She's a long-standing establishment Democrat who's received support and endorsements from the likes of Michael Bloomberg and both Bill and Hillary Clinton. Number 6 on my list is Keisha Lance Bottoms, who has served as mayor of Atlanta since 2017, and prior to that was a member of Atlanta City Council. While not as widely known as some of the other names on this list, the Atlanta mayor has caught some attention in the COVID era for sharply rebuking Georgia Governor Brian Kemp's decision to open up the state for business. She's also clashed with Trump in the past over immigration and refugee issues, claiming that her city will remain open and welcome for all, and that it does not support ICE. The Atlanta mayor has also been a loyal surrogate for the Biden campaign, appearing regularly on cable TV. She endorsed Biden for president back in June of 2019. As a VP pick, Mayor Bottoms has been supported by another loyal Biden supporter, Jim Clyburn, whose late endorsement of Joe Biden was widely credited for bringing his campaign back to life. Clyburn told the Financial Times, "There is a young lady right there in Georgia who I think would make a tremendous VP candidate. That's the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms." Like Stacey Abrams, Mayor Bottoms could potentially put Georgia into play in the 2020 election. Unlike Abrams, she's endorsed Biden early and has spent more time promoting Biden rather than promoting herself to Biden. But every candidate comes with downsides. For Bottoms, experience is definitely an issue, as is her general lack of nationwide name recognition. She also doesn't have a wholly squeaky clean record, as her campaign's failure to properly disclose campaign donations led to an ethics investigation. Ultimately, her campaign voluntarily returned over $25,000 in contributions from an engineering contractor whose office had been previously raided by the FBI. Coming in at number 5 on my list of most likely Biden VP picks is Susan Rice. While not quite as talked about as many of the names on this list, Susan Rice is probably one of the best prepared to step in as president amid a crisis. During the Obama administration, she served as National Security Advisor and as Ambassador to the United Nations. She also served as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under Bill Clinton. As a top advisor to Obama, Rice was obviously a well-known entity to Joe Biden, someone he's worked closely with in the past. Having a pre-existing relationship with Biden probably makes her a more comfortable choice for a man who has stated that he's looking for a simpatico running mate. But there's a few things that set Rice back. While she's a seasoned Washington insider with extensive executive branch experience, she's never held an elected office. So with Rice, there's a larger risk that voters won't find her appealing. Her selection would also likely improve voter turnout for Trump supporters. She's been accused of intentionally misleading the public about the 2012 Benghazi attack, and her inaugural day email has been touted as evidence that the Obama administration spied on Trump's campaign officials. It's unclear whether Biden's campaign is all that worried about what Trump voters think, but exciting the opposition's base is probably not a good electoral strategy. Up next at number 4, I have Val Demings, U.S. Representative from Florida's 10th Congressional District since 2017, and before that, Chief of the Orlando Police, the first woman to hold that position. Demings' committee assignments include Homeland Security, Judiciary, and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Considering those assignments, it's not surprising that she was selected as one of the 7 impeachment managers who presented the case against Donald Trump during his trial in the Senate. As a black woman from a traditional swing state, she's been regularly listed as a potential VP pick, and has been reported that she's among the leading candidates for the nomination. But there are some reasons to think she might be a less than perfect choice. Critics of Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record have referred to her as Kamala the Cop, but Demings actually was a cop, and not exactly the kind that black activists support. She was no progressive advocate of community policing and reform. Rather, she's been accused of overseeing police brutality. Her tenure as OPD chief was dogged with a long record of excessive force allegations. An Orlando Sentinel investigation found that in 2010, the agency used force 20% more often than officers in Baton Rouge, a city of similar size, racial makeup, and police resources. That very same year, an Orlando police officer flipped and broke the neck of an 84-year-old. Demings defended the officer, but a federal jury disagreed, awarding the victim nearly $900,000 in damages. Another issue with Demings is experience. While U.S. senators and governors are generally considered sufficiently prepared, or as prepared as one can be, to assume the role of the president, a relatively new member of Congress is not likely to be seen as especially seasoned. At number 3 on my list, I have New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. Aside from being the only Latina governor in the country, prior to assuming that office at the top of 2019, she represented New Mexico's 1st congressional district in the House beginning in 2013, and actually became chairwoman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. This gives her a rare combination of high-level executive experience and experience in Washington politics. Lujan Grisham's deep roots in New Mexico politics would no doubt be of use to the Biden team. While the swing state has tended to lean Democratic, reporting suggests that Trump's team has its sights set on the state. As Governor Lujan Grisham has joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, fought for the repeal of New Mexico's 1969 abortion law, and pushed a plan to create tuition-free college for all New Mexicans. The latter 2 efforts, however, have stalled in the state's legislature. One of the biggest downsides to the governor is that she doesn't exactly bring excitement to Biden's ticket. She's pushed for some interesting things in New Mexico, but does not have a strong record of significant accomplishments as of yet. In Congress, her committee assignments were agriculture and the budget. To be honest, even her scandals are somewhat boring. In 2016, she was one of 9 members who took a trip to Azerbaijan that was found to be improperly funded, although all involved were cleared by the Ethics Committee. Currently, she's under fire for buying jewelry amid coronavirus closures, but her office claims the purchase did not violate lockdown rules. I'm not sure if she did break her own rules or not, but I am sure that I'm boring myself talking about such a low-stakes scandal. At the end of the day, a Latina New Mexican governor with Washington experience is probably a pretty solid get, and being relatively boring is not the worst trade-off. The less the press has to say about the Biden ticket, the more the election will be about Donald Trump. While he has a passionate base of support, Trump is a historically unpopular president overall. So if this election is framed mainly as a referendum on his first term, Biden is very likely to secure a victory. At number 2, the penultimate person on my list is Senator Elizabeth Warren. Warren is an extremely well-known liberal U.S. senator. She is perhaps best known for spearheading the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau during the Obama administration. She was also one of the top contenders in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary race, in which she championed a number of progressive policies, including a transition to Medicare for all, a wealth tax, and breaking up large tech companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google. During the primaries, Warren also did Joe Biden at least two big favors. First, she likely blunted Bernie Sanders' support by staying in the race well past Super Tuesday and by not endorsing Sanders after she dropped out. She was also probably the most forceful critic of Michael Bloomberg, absolutely decimating him on the debate stage, thus preventing him from being a major competitor for Biden and picking up moderate voters during Super Tuesday. To many, Warren is seen as the best chance progressives have of getting a champion in Biden's administration. And indeed, one wise tactic for Biden at this point might be to shore up his left flank. In terms of shoring up his left flank, though, Warren is an imperfect choice. While Warren certainly has a long record of being one of the most progressive senators in the country, she also has a big problem when it comes to maintaining the trust of highly engaged progressive voters. This stems in part from some of the shifts she's made in terms of policy preferences since the Veep stakes began. She's begun to hold big money fundraisers for Joe Biden, despite rejecting big money for the primaries. And perhaps even more significantly, she's backed off from Medicare for all, a key policy issue for the senator during the primaries. Mistrust for Warren amongst progressives also stems from her beef with the most popular progressive in the country, Bernie Sanders. Back in 2016, Warren did not endorse Bernie, which many of his supporters saw as a slight to the progressive movement. During the 2020 primary, she accused Bernie of saying he didn't think a woman could win against Trump. Then, as I just mentioned, stayed in the race past when she had a realistic chance of winning, and once again did not endorse Sanders after she finally dropped out. For many Bernie-crats, Warren is no longer to be trusted. She's not a team player and is more interested in her own political fortunes than the progressive movement. Indeed, aligned with many of his supporters, Sanders has declined to support Warren as a VP pick for Biden. Warren is certainly a very big name with plenty of experience, but if the best reason to select her as VP would be as an olive branch to the left, unfortunately for Warren, there's a good argument to make that she has become too divisive a figure in progressive circles. Still, support for Warren as Biden's VP pick is substantial overall. She is the #1 choice for Democratic voters in poll after poll after poll. According to yet another survey, one by Morning Consult from the end of May, Warren would make 26% of registered voters more likely to vote for Biden and 23% less likely to do so. This net gain of 3% is higher than all other candidates mentioned in that survey, which included Klobuchar, Harris, Abrams, Whitmer, Baldwin, Cortez Masto, Demings, and Lujan Grisham. In this survey, Warren also does especially better where it matters most, voters in demographic groups that are less likely to turn out to vote. Amongst Hispanics, the gain with Warren is 28 points. That's substantially better than any of the others mentioned in this survey. Gains in black voters is 24 points, again better than all the rest. And with young voters, once more, it's a blowout, 12 points gained with Warren. The only downside for Warren is she decreases the odds of older folks voting for Biden by 4 percentage points. And yet, only two other candidates on the list hurt less. Harris decreases this vote by just 3 points, and Klobuchar improves it by just 2. With these numbers, it's pretty tough to argue that Warren wouldn't improve Biden's ticket. Really, the best reason not to select Warren is that she's probably too big for the job. One of the most recognizable faces in the Democratic Party, it would be quite difficult for Biden's campaign to redefine her in their own image. Her recent policy shifts might more closely align her to Biden's philosophy of governing, but because she is a known entity, it's not hard to characterize the more moderate tone as hypocrisy or flip-flopping. Biden and his team are also probably highly aware that the popular senator has the potential to outshine the top of the ticket, and generally speaking, that's not a desirable quality for a running mate. Topping my list at #1 of the most likely Joe Biden running mates is Senator Kamala Harris of California. Prior to her ascension to the Senate, Harris served as the 32nd Attorney General of California from 2011 to 2017, and before that, District Attorney of California. Generally ranked as one of the more liberal senators in the country when it comes to voting record, Harris is still, roughly speaking, a liberal moderate. and thus not insimpatico for Biden. Harris tops most lists of potential Biden running mates, and for good reason. In terms of readiness for the role, Harris was frequently listed in the early days of the Democratic primary election as a top contender to become the nominee for president. While she certainly floundered in some of those debates, overall she had a number of strong performances, and dropped out of the race before voters spent too much time watching her fail. Running one of the more popular presidential campaigns in the primary race has cast her as one of the most visible Democrats in the country. As a black woman, Harris has also commonly been cited as an example of an acceptable running mate by those urging Biden to pick a woman of color. She also has Indian heritage, which could help tap into an often overlooked demographic bloc, Asian Americans. But Harris's blackness is not the only reason why she might be a smart play for winning over black voters. Of all the Democratic primary contenders, Harris was the loudest voice in calling out Biden's less than perfect record on race, criticizing his past support for busing and past praise for some of his segregationist colleagues in Congress. This made for perhaps the most stunning moment of the Democratic primary debates.
It's personal, and it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country.
Biden has already won Harris's endorsement for president, of course, but adding her to the ticket could work toward symbolically absolving Biden of his past racial indiscretions in the minds of voters. Not surprisingly, while Warren has generally dominated the opinion polls in the Veep stakes and was the favored candidate of minorities early on, Harris has risen as increasingly preferred by minority voters. According to a YouGov poll from mid-June, 25% of black voters said they preferred Harris, which is substantially more than the 15% now supporting Warren. Harris was also the top choice of 33% of Hispanic voters, 4 points higher than the support held by Warren. Still, there are potential concerns with Harris. While some polling is now showing Harris gaining support amongst minorities, during the Democratic primaries, Harris never did as well with black voters or minorities in general as the two old white guys leading the pack, Biden and Sanders. No doubt part of the problem with Harris is her mixed record as a prosecutor. Harris often bragged about being a progressive prosecutor, but that's not an accurate description of her entire history. Many of the ugly spots in her prosecutorial record were articulated quite clearly by Tulsi Gabbard in one of the other more stunning moments of the Democratic primary debates.
She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place. That impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Another issue with Harris is that being from California, she doesn't come with an additional swing state boost like many of the other candidates on this list. That said, there's good reason to suspect that home state advantage of running mates is not a particularly powerful effect. Paul Ryan did not deliver Wisconsin to Mitt Romney, John Edwards did not deliver North Carolina to John Kerry, and Jack Kemp certainly didn't deliver New York to Bob Dole. Despite the drawbacks, Kamala Harris is an extremely likely choice for Biden. There are numerous well-known or experienced potential Veeps in contention, but most of them could be ruled out based on one observation.
You ain't black.
There's a tremendous pressure on Biden to pick not just a woman, and not just a woman of color, but a black woman. While young people and Latinos are arguably equally significant demographics to mobilize, there is a clear perception that Biden owes the black community. After all, without the black voters of South Carolina and beyond, Biden would not be the nominee. Were it not for Barack Obama, Biden never would have benefited from 8 years of media coverage while he did a high-profile do-nothing job alongside the man who remains today the most popular Democrat in the country. For the last 15 years, the black community, its politicians, and its voters has lifted Biden into power. It's highly likely that a combination of media pressure, internal analysis, and perhaps Biden's own conscience will motivate him to pick a black running mate. Among the best options, Harris probably ties Stacey Abrams as the most well-known female black politician in the country. Of the two, Harris is significantly more experienced, more connected in Washington, and favorable to DNC insiders. Ditto with other top black choices, like Val Demings and Keisha Lance Bottoms. Now, speaking of Stacey Abrams, let's wrap up this video by talking very briefly about some of the more popular names that did not make this list, beginning with the almost governor of Georgia, Stacey Abrams. Abrams is at this point very unlikely to be among top contention in the Veep stakes because she has not been contacted by the Biden team for vetting. While she was actually the first name Biden's team ever floated as a potential running mate, insiders claim the campaign soured on her as an option, in part because of her unorthodox public campaigning for the role. Much of the mainstream media seemed to sour on her as well, with the Washington Post, for example, publishing an op-ed called "Stacey Abrams Should Be Taken Out of the Veep Stakes." When Biden's team first floated her as a potential Veep, Abrams was a fresh face on the national stage. Having narrowly lost her gubernatorial bid in an election many saw as fraught with voter suppression, and for the response she gave to the 2019 State of the Union speech. While she remains widely talked about and popular amongst many voters, she was probably never a very serious choice to make. Minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives is sufficient experience to become a governor or even a US senator, but not for vice president. Gretchen Whitmer is another honorable mention. The governor has certainly gained considerable national attention as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Her rather bold lockdown orders have led to significant protests, mainly among Trump supporters. At the same time, polls have found her handling of the pandemic was approved of by almost 2/3 of her constituents. Despite the popularity of Whitmer's coronavirus performance, her overall job approval is not necessarily substantial or stable. Back in January, just 43% approved of her job performance, compared to 35% who disapproved. These aren't horrifying numbers for a first-term governor, but they do not demonstrate massive popularity. While selecting Whitmer as a VP could certainly be about locking down the state of Michigan, it's unclear whether she'll retain her pandemic popularity into November. There's at least some reason to doubt it. In general, her tenure as governor has been marked by partisan gridlock, with a Republican-led legislature. In 2018, she campaigned in part on a promise to fix the roads, but her attempts to fund the effort have largely been thwarted. She's now going forward with a substantially less ambitious road repair effort. Whitmer's visibility and favorability have both increased significantly in the COVID era, but it's unclear how valuable an asset she'd be once her 15 minutes in the spotlight are up. Amy Klobuchar has also been widely talked about, with many assuming when it was announced that she was undergoing vetting that she would obviously be the choice. I think she was never as good a choice as she was cracked up to be, and apparently she agrees. She withdrew from the running, recommending that Biden pick a woman of color. Catherine Cortez Masto is another person who was widely floated but withdrew relatively recently from contention. In fact, she was never all that interested in the job. Cortez Masto was asked by CBS back in November whether she would say no if offered the VP slot on the 2020 Democratic ticket. Her response, "That is correct." When she was later asked about whether she'd changed her mind, she refused to comment. A source close to her team then stated that she's not actively campaigning to be Biden's running mate. Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo has been more recently talked about as a potential option, and she has, like most people I've mentioned in this video, reported to have undergone vetting by Team Biden. But there's really no reason to pick her as a running mate. She's not a person of color. As a centrist, she's not winning over progressives. As a Rhode Islander, she offers no regional advantages. She's also not well known nationwide. While Raimondo might have sufficient experience, there's nothing else about her that makes her a standout candidate for the role. She's not by any means the most exciting choice, nor is she amongst the most qualified among the boring choices. I'm frankly shocked they've even bothered to vet her. Okay, so just to wrap up this video, let me clarify that Kamala Harris is not my top pick for Biden. I'd personally prefer Ayanna Pressley or Nina Turner if he's narrowed in on picking a black woman. But for Biden and his team, Harris is probably looking like a near perfect option. Of course, that's just what I think Biden thinks. Let me know what you think Biden thinks in the comments down below. Who will he pick?